I appreciate people who are authentic to what they believe in. So, because I always know exactly what I'm getting with people who are really authentic, which I appreciate because that's not everybody. So,
Yeah, well, I think I think I try to be that way no matter what. And it's look, to be clear, I think it's helped me a lot in my career, and it's probably hurt me a little bit in my career, and that's fine. It just sort of is what it is. I think it just means that you're probably not where you were meant to be, or at least to be around the people that you're around. I think it's okay. I
I'd
think what's
rather
lost
be
is people don't like to be
myself.
challenged anymore.
Yeah, and I'd say this: I'd rather be myself and repel the wrong people who I don't want to be associated with than pretend to be someone else and end up in places where I am constantly having to be or pretending to be someone else.
Yeah, there's a saying, right? I'd rather be hated for who I am than loved for who I'm not. And look, I've got people that I count as really good friends that we have differences of opinion on certain things. Maybe politics being one of them. That doesn't mean I try not to paint with a broad brush because I know that these are people that I still care a lot about and that I consider good friends. It's just okay that if we're going to have a difference of opinion on a few things, because I'm not going to cut someone. I'm not going to necessarily, unless they do something horrible themselves, then I'm probably not going to cut them out of my life, just because we have a difference of opinion. Some people might not agree with that, and that's fine too.
So you're 30 years in, Hall of Famers, Cy Young Award winners, MLB managers. When you look back over your career, what are you most proud of?
The relationships, the fact that, the people that fall into some of those categories that you just mentioned, I can pick up the phone and give them a call, shoot them a text, and I know I'm going to get a response. And I think that's not out of obligation. I think that's out of building genuine relationships. And look, it's just really kind of, I tell people this all the time. I fell into baseball on a goof, really. I mean, I just took a flyer um, back in 96. And, my first season of baseball was in 97. I just saw an opportunity, met some people that worked in baseball, and I saw some opportunity there, and I took a shot. I mean, I was a college football coach who did strength conditioning and just reached a crossroads that I was going to have to probably pick one path or the other. And I enjoyed being in the weight room, and I didn't love recruiting. I'm not a great salesperson, so the weight room made the most sense, and the profession just really was really taking off in a big way, so that I couldn't sort of straddle the fence anymore, and that's that.
What enabled you to build those deeper relationships with some of those guys?
I think being authentic, is you talked about at the outset. I wasn't trying to sell them anything that wasn't what I thought was going to be valuable to them. I wasn't trying to sell sizzle without the steak, so to speak. And, I was going to be in it with them. I tried to even this is sometimes where I struggle on two sides of the coin. Mm, I grew up in a time when people that were in authority, let's in particular coaches told you to do something, you did it, right? You didn't really question it. What I learned is that the good coaches, maybe they didn't tell you why immediately, but they backfilled it. So that encouraged building a relationship. And I tried to do that, even if it wasn't necessarily consciously. I wanted to be able to sell them on the value of what we were trying to do, because our role, especially as strength and conditioning coaches in general, but our role as strength and conditioning coaches is to ask athletes to do difficult things that are not comfortable. And they don't all love it, right? They certainly love what they're doing, but they don't always love the stuff that is adjacent to that. Um,
Right.
I mean, it's one of the most entertaining clips out there, right? Allen Iverson. We're talking about practice, right? And not everybody loves the weight room. They don't love to be put in uncomfortable situations, and that's what work. That's my role. So I think that being genuine and being invested in that with intention and being genuine throughout that is what helped me build the relationships. I will also say I think what helped me a lot in baseball having been a coach, a position coach and a sport coach afforded me a little bit different way to communicate with the baseball coaches versus just being sort of, even though I was the weight room guy and I was, especially early on in the mid 90s, I was a little bit of an outlier when it came to baseball. I roll in there with, a 200, at that time, 250 to 260 pounds and throwing a lot of weight around. I was one of the earlier guys that sort of came from college, um, and tried to bring that mindset of intentional training, intentional preparation to baseball. I think it helped me create buy-in with the coaches, which in turn helped me create buy-in with the athletes. So I think I was able to communicate kind of on both ends, because we're kind of placed in the middle, much like athletic trainers. You're kind of in the middle of it all. And we just tried to always be very open. Nothing was a secret. It wasn't, it wasn't so much, as I said earlier, to do what I said because I said so and I'm the coach, especially at the pro level versus college. But I think that's what really helped me. And I think they respected the things that I was doing personally from a training standpoint. I think that helped create some buy-in. And when they knew I wasn't trying to turn them into me, that also helped because when I first met Al Leiter at a Christmas party in New York, when I got my first big league job with the Mets, I was introduced to Al by Michael Kay, who's the radio guy for the Yankees. And Michael's like, "Hey, Al, this is your new strength coach." And Al looked me up and down. He goes, "We don't want to look like you, right?" So yeah, yes, Al, I'm aware. It's not my first year in baseball. It's just my first big league job. So, um, but yeah, so that again, just sort of the idea of being open and genuine with the guys
I
helped.
always say the best programs and organizations are directly downstream from the strength and conditioning programs. The culture and the tone that those guys set, I have always felt, is a direct influence on the actual performance and the culture of a team. And I don't think it's possible for a team to be successful or an individual to be successful without the proper strength and conditioning coaches. For you, what is it that you do that may be different or unique that allows you to get that trust from some of these world class athletes pretty quickly?
Well, I think wrapped in that question is the idea of what we in our role are empowered to do. And I think it's sport. It can be sport, and then the subcategory would be organizational specific or philosophy. Very early on, what we did was very secondary. It wasn't necessarily supported by all the coaches, but if there was organizational support, then it was hard for coaches, especially old school coaches who didn't necessarily believe in or trust in this aspect of player development. At the very least, they didn't have to necessarily be supportive, but they had to be silent, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So I was very lucky that coming into the Cleveland organization in the mid 90s, they were one of the first, if not the first, organization that was putting a strength conditioning coach at every level of their minor leagues. And
Sorry to interrupt. So strength and conditioning wasn't like a regular part of professional baseball until mid 90s.
yeah, without a doubt. Yeah. I'd have to really think hard in 1997 if every major league team even had a full-time dedicated head strength conditioning coach.
So they just didn't find the value in weight and strength training.
Right? Baseball players didn't lift weights. That's
Huh.
that's kind of how it was. That now you were just getting into that, but you're just getting into that mid '90s era, right? You think about the great home run race. Sosa and McGuire. There's a spotlight on that. And, despite some of the peripheral things that are said about that era, let's just take that out of it. There's still guys still had to train and still had to work hard. Okay. Um, and there became a recognition that, well, if our guys are going to do this, we better make sure that we've got some people with knowledge to help, at the very least, put some guardrails in place. Because just like, just like now, the idea of your athletes, and in particular baseball players, where it's a high skill and motor pattern game, you don't want them going and training like bodybuilders. So, right, you start to try to find the path to bring in people who were training for performance on the field versus training to train or training for looks or aesthetics or what have you. So, right, because we all know there's different ways, depending on what your end game is, there's different ways to train for that end game and that outcome. So, and if you think about like old school pitching, what did pitchers do? Pitchers ran a ton. And I don't mean sprints and intervals. They just went out and ran, because it was conditioning. And, in retrospect, you can take a lot of the research and the science aspect of it, and you could see where the value lied and where it was counterproductive what you were actually trying to do based on the needs of the sport. So that time frame, Cleveland, Fernando Montez, who was the head strength coach, Fernando had come from Stanford University as
Mhm.
a strength conditioning coach, and he also had an athletic training background. So he was really kind of early on. He was the nice mix where he could kind of sell the aspect of, hey, I'm an athletic trainer, I'm a certified athletic trainer as well, so I know what might be counterproductive, but also I'm a strength conditioning coach who's worked with high level athletes and worked for Bill Walsh, worked for Dennis Green, and said, okay, well, let's try to, find the best of both worlds and make that happen. And what Fernando really excelled at was like being organized and being intentional and having a system in place. And, at the same time, you can do kind of what you're allowed, but I think it's important to be able to try to push the boundaries to sell, so to speak, what you're trying to accomplish and the value of that for your athletes. And
When I
so,
when I look at baseball players from like a functional physique standpoint, it's very different than football, which is different from soccer, which is different from basketball. Is there a particular reason the demands of the sport of baseball may have baseball players look a little bit different? Because you look at a lot of these guys and they're not shredded. I'm sure some of them are, but you have a lot of guys who may be perceived as a little overweight. You get the Babe Ruth jokes, right? And obviously that was a different time frame, but some of the best hitters in baseball aren't by definition rocked up, right? They may carry a little bit more weight, but it meets the demands of their sport. So I'm kind of curious from that perspective, what is different about training a baseball player than maybe training a football player or basketball player?
well, I think one of the things that really stands out is that there's really no physical blueprint for baseball. And I literally have slides and a presentation, kind of in the can presentation that I will use at certain times and talk about. There's always outliers, right? Basketball, you have like Muggsy Bogues. In football, you had like London Fletcher, at 5'9", and Sam Mills at 5'9", playing middle linebacker in the NFL, right? Those are outliers. In baseball, you kind of have your little area that you're responsible for and in the field, right? I joke that baseball is not really, I like to say, a four-dimensional sport because it's not really chaos. It's not soccer. It's not American football, even though, you run organized plays, but there's still a lot of chaos that's happening, a lot more reactive.
Mhm.
For me, the fourth dimension is that the maybe the vertical aspect
Mm.
of athleticism. And baseball, you've kind of got your own little patch of ground that you're responsible for, and you've got two really motor pattern specific skills that are being executed play by play. Right, you've got a pitcher throwing the baseball, and you've got a batter trying to hit the baseball. You can be 5'8". You can be David Eckstein, who I had as an athlete, loved, one of the greatest, nicest human beings there is out there. Too nice. Um, but you can have David Eckstein playing shortstop, World Series MVP at like 5'7", 5'8", and I might even be being generous. This little pasty white, super nice, clean cut dude. And on the other end of that at shortstop, you're going to have someone like Alex Rodriguez, who's 6'3", 4", whatever, 230 pounds, 225 pounds, playing the exact same position, exact same requirements. And look at the size differential. You have Tim Lincecum, who, same thing, was maybe 5'8", throwing in the mid 90s as a pitcher, winning Cy Young awards. and you had Greg Maddux at 5'11", give or take, throwing with precision, winning 355 games. Jake Peavy at 6'1" ish, 190 pounds, who could squat 405 for five, win a Cy Young, throwing in the low 90s, throwing with control. And then you had someone like Chris Young and Randy Johnson, who are both, 6'10", 6'11", with two very different body types at that height. And all those guys are doing they all have the exact same job. So, but I couldn't train all five of those guys in the same way. There could be aspects or variations of certain, obviously the needs to work back from, but you can't train all those guys the exact same way because their bodies aren't going to be conducive to certain things that you might think are going to be valuable for one person, but not going to be as valuable or counterproductive for another. Like you're
That
probably
was
not
actually
putting
going to be one of my questions is like, how customized can it be to the individual? And, or is it just broad concepts that should apply to everyone, or is it a little bit of both?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think you try to have sort of, again, the guardrails in place, certain valuable working motor patterns that you're trying to get good at. But, I'm probably not putting about, although I used to do back squats with Chris Young, but he was a big, robust athlete, former center in basketball. He got offered NBA contracts, and he had to stop playing basketball in college before he was done because he had signed his first pro contract in the Ivy League. You couldn't double dip. You couldn't do that. Once you were pro in one sport, you were done. It wasn't like when, say, Ricky Williams was still playing running back in college, got drafted by, I think it was the Phillies, and played a couple summers of minor league baseball. But, at Chris's size and the success he had in basketball before turning pro in baseball, he got offered NBA contracts. But Randy Johnson, who I did not have as an athlete, who I've had a couple interesting conversations with, but Randy Johnson wasn't putting a bar on his back and squatting. Just too long, kind of too narrow, just didn't have the body type that was ideal for it. But had I trained Randy, I would have probably talked to him about the value of the pattern and trying to work on the pattern in some aspect, goblet squats, just something, physio ball, wall squats, just whatever. And then find other ways to load him, for a better strength outcome. But that's, and that's the same thing I would approach because everybody moves a little bit different. Baseball can wreck you from a symmetry standpoint, especially back in the day, I think much more than now because there's a much more there's much greater awareness to the value of training. So I think it's kind of having those sort of your base philosophy in place and knowing what maybe you think is ideal or optimal, and that knowing that there may have to be regressions for the athletes and the individuals that aren't as good at some things as others, and then some progressions for the guys that are really good. And there are the outlier athletes in baseball, well, even in football, like in any sport, that are great adapters and, maybe have a high mesomorph aspect to their physique. And you may need to dial back what they're doing and talk to them about, hey, you know what, you don't need it. And you kind of figure out what strength holds, at what point is sort of enough. And I think that's going to be very individual because, a guy who can maybe squat 1.5 times his body weight, that might be plenty for him versus the other individual that's capable of 2 or 2+ times his body weight. How much more do you have to keep chasing the quality that they've kind of already mastered? Right.
Yeah. So like, I think about it too, like the higher you get at certain point, you're going to hit your peak in terms of the weight that you can move, how strong you are, relatively speaking, how hard you throw. So when it comes to like those training protocols and you're maximizing or you've maximized your ceiling in terms of physical development, maybe it's how do you still strain the body without just unnecessarily pushing for more? What goes into that process?
Yeah. Well, I think it's kind of, how are you going to distribute their workload? And again, if we're talking about baseball in a situation where you're playing a game just about every day, you have to be hyper aware of that. And there are going to be days where an athlete is going to be fully equipped to kind of have a full workout. And there are going to be other days where you might have to dial it back. I mean, again, it's kind of how the game's changed, right? It used to be nobody worked out during the day. Everybody worked out after a game. Maybe the only guys training during the day might have been probably pitchers, a starting pitcher that's somewhere in between his rotation starts, and then a reliever who threw the night before and is probably might not be live that day. That's changed drastically, but so it's really all in having discussions, I think, with your athletes. I think nothing really tells you about an athlete's readiness than just asking, "Hey, how do you feel today? This is kind of what we've got on the schedule. How do you feel about that? Where are we at?" Or if a guy, did happen to work out after. I was with Pittsburgh, Charlie Marte and Gregory Polanco always after the game. Come in together. He told me to put Bad Bunny on, right? But I knew who Bad Bunny was long before long before anybody else did, because Marte would walk in the weight room, he'd be Malone, Malone, Bad Bunny, Bad Bunny. And so I'd put it on Pandora or Spotify and let it rip. But
Mm.
if they came in and they were dragging a little bit, then I'd say, okay, well, look, here's kind of what we had on tap. Let's strip it down to these two things, or let's strip it down to two sets of everything versus three, because we're training for performance and readiness. We're not training to peak for a 1RM 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks down the road, right? I mean, their most important KPI is playing the game every day. And starting pitchers, who I've always said in baseball are the easiest guys to program for, because you know what their schedule is, barring a rain out or some sort of, maybe scheduling issue. But even them, it doesn't just fit neatly on a 8-week plan on your Excel sheet or in your program. There's always going to be some variability. And it really always comes back to being prepared and ready to play when it's your time to play. It's not about me trying to prove numbers in the weight room. I've never been a big advocate, and maybe spending so much time in pro ball has helped me define this. I don't need to put up a leaderboard for training or weightlift or training or outcomes to provide proof of what we've accomplished in the weight room. Obviously, you want to see progress in certain things, but that's really going to be dependent on kind of what your overall program and maybe organizational philosophy is, and figuring out what the important things to be keyed on are. But in the end, it's still going to be showing up and being able to play and perform. I mean, I talk about three things when it comes to training that are important. Number one is improved performance on the field or the court or the rank or whatever it might be. So we're going to try to spend time doing things that are going to help with that. Not so much what's going to get your squat up, or how big a bench press can you get, or what's your deadlift or clean. Number two is creating athlete durability and injury prevention, which I think are byproducts of a sound program. I think if that becomes kind of the focal point, you're probably not really training aggressively enough to elicit the type of adaptation and work potential that you could. And then last is like that much more personal aspect to help each athlete reach their full potential. And how do I/we in the performance domain, make that happen? And that might be different. That's going to be different for everybody on the roster there, because everybody's full potential is going to be a little bit different.
When I reflect back over my career and I think about how I had to change the way that I trained and the way that I competed, I like to think that the latter part of when I changed the way that I trained, if I had trained that way the entirety of my career, that I may have had a different outcome in my career. Now I'm very proud and I did make it to a very far level. Most people would say I overachieved. However, in my own world, I felt I underachieved, because in the latter part of my career, I saw the heights that I could personally reach. And I think about your pillars. And I noticed that your number one and two things to me are the most important, right? Actual performance on the field, number one, and number two, staying healthy. And so over my career, the number of broken bones, surgeries, torn ligaments that I've had are unbelievable. And then I think about a lot of my training protocols at the time, and it felt like it was more chasing numbers on the squat, chasing numbers on the bench, and less about how do I fundamentally perform better on the field. And I have two questions here. The first question is, how do we utilize the weight room in direct correlation to performance on the field? And then my second question will be injury related that I want to circle back to, but I really want to understand how do we fundamentally measure from or transition from the weight room to performance on the field? What is the correlation and connection there?
Yeah, it's hard. I don't know if there's a correlation. I think the connection lies in communicating with the sport coaches for a couple different reasons. Number one thing about us as strength conditioning coaches or performance professionals is unless you're a powerlifting coach or a weightlifting coach, everything you're doing is to help those athletes do something different and be better at what they're doing as an athlete. And no matter how fancy our title might be, senior, associate, athletic director in charge of physical performance, or head strength conditioning coach, or vice president of athlete performance and readiness, anything like whatever you want to put on it, whatever's helping you get a bigger salary, whatever. You're still an assistant to those sport coaches. You're still a subordinate to that, especially in particular the head coach, right? Because if you go back and you talked about culture and kind of where that might fit in into the bigger picture. The hand in hand, the mesh point is that we as strength conditioning professionals really have a grasp on what the sport coaches are looking for, because I can get an athlete to jump his squat by 20%, maybe shave, a couple tenths of a second off of a particular field time that's being measured. But if it's not helping change what they're doing from a player performance standpoint, then at best, it's a net neutral outcome. And that's, of course, better than a negative. But, is that because maybe the athletes reached their actual performance ceiling, right? They've maxed out, they've tapped out. Or is it because maybe we don't have a full understanding of the sport or the game or the individual and coaches, sorry, what those coaches and what the organization are looking for out of that athlete. So I think it eventually becomes about problem solving and trying to figure out, what tools in our toolbox do we need to use to help find the most favorable outcome for the team first, especially if it's a team sport, and where that individual athlete fits into the team needs and outcome, and then right the athlete needs for their outcome. So I would say it's that. I don't think you can label any one thing in the weight room or what we do even on the field as being the make or break thing. I think sort of from that neutral line, right? When it comes to the positive. And there are plenty of things we could do to F up an athlete. There are plenty of things we could do to regress, to literally ruin what they're trying to do as athletes. I think you also have to kind of a conscious awareness of that. And maybe that kind of comes back to the idea of just deciding, having an awareness of, like if sort of an athlete is maxed out a particular bucket, if we just, use that term, how much more time do you need to spend on that? Right. Even if an athlete is maybe capable of more, is it more just for the sake of chasing numbers, or is it more because it might actually help them out?
So
So
in that
that's
realm, in direct relation to injury, then how much of like injury is genetic? And maybe not a fair question to ask, but if we were to like assign percentages, like what is it like genetically versus how much we can actually prevent from happening through strength and conditioning? Because throughout my career, I've had 5 knee surgeries. I currently have torn labrum. I had fractured and separated the shoulder in the past, broken leg multiple times, fractured knee, sprained ankles, fractured 3 vertebrae in my back, wrist surgery, fractured my other shoulder. I've had just about every broken bone, torn ligament that you could have. And I felt like a ton of my training was, again, part of my career, but I've still had injuries since then, was injury prevention. And I still get hurt and quote unquote did everything right. And it's something I've been searching for in my own life because I refuse to label myself as injury prone, but understanding that there is a genetic component to this that and I speak for a lot of athletes that I see out there, can't seem to get over that injury bug.
Yeah, well, remember you played a sport that, you know, has a physics component to it, right? That is
And being
just
5'9",
unyielding,
185 pounds
is
didn't
is
help me in
unyielding,
my sport.
right?
So
And unrelenting. And the fact that, it's like, right, they talk about it's like the idea of being in a car accident every, once every 40 seconds, especially depending on, the position you played. You played defensive back. Your role was to seek out people and try to take them out, right? I mean, and because you were, you know, quote, undersized, you probably played with a chip on your shoulder, which made you that much more, not necessarily reckless. I think, look, there's an expiration date on all of us. And, some people are durable and like indestructible, but those are the outliers. I think that, geez, especially in football, it's not like if you get hurt, it's when, and it's just the kind of the degree of like what can you play with or through.
I think
You
the
know,
part that drives me the most mad, right, is like I said, I did everything right. Like I never drank, I didn't do drugs. Like I went to
maybe that's the
bed on
problem.
time. I was about
Maybe
to
you were
say
wound
that
too tight. You were wound too tight.
some of these cats, man, they drank, they did drugs, they never went to sleep on time, and
No
they never got
doubt.
hurt. They never got hurt ever. And I'd be like, what? Like, what is going on right now? But like to your point though, like I never felt like I never like wanted to do those things. So it didn't feel like I was giving much up. Like it didn't feel like I was wound too tight. And I think that was the part that like bothered me was like it wasn't like I was like, man, I want to go out and like have fun. Like I never felt I was deprived of fun in like my career and my life. I'm just kind of unique in that way. Like I just wasn't drawn or interested in doing some of those things. But like I knew functionally that I was a healthy person in like choice. Like I was doing healthy things, but like my body just didn't respond. And I think that, and obviously, I understand like the physics component of my sport, it just like that type of stuff is like when I reflect and people ask me, like what I think about it, like I default to, I think some of it's genetic, right? Like I don't know because like that's not my area that I spend a lot of time in,
Right.
but just that's the only rationalization I have is why I got hurt so much. Is some of it was probably just genetic, and it's something I continue to work through as I try to compete and stay really active, um, as I continue to do those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're biological mechanisms. There's a fragility to us, to all of us, and I think again, if you want to like sort of get into the genetic talk of it, and I think it really just comes down. I don't think it's necessarily something that's in your genes. I think it's in your genes in the sense that like how fortified are you sort of from the inside out? Like what's your kind of where does your somatotype score fall? Like how much of a mesomorph are you? How heavy boned are you? How much of an endomorph are you as far as like robustness? How much of an ectomorph are you as far as like maybe length and frailty of bone? Not that that's a part of being ectomorph, but muscle bellies, tendon thickness, connective tissue. It really kind of comes back to we used to joke about picking the right parents. Kevin Barr, who's a longtime Major League Baseball strength coach and one of the funniest human beings I know, KB just talked about genetic trash versus genetic jackpot, and we just kind of I think we all have an expiration date, and it just happens, right? There's wear and tear on our body. I think the idea that, kids are indestructible, we're finding out that's not the case. And the mileage and the wear and tear, especially in the sport of baseball, we're finding out that rent is coming due as these kids turn 18, 19, 20 years old, pitchers especially. And, we talk about the epidemic of Tommy John surgeries and what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? But, what we need to do is we need to take control of what's happening between the time that they're 10, 11-year olds till they're 17, 18-year olds,
Yeah, talk to me
because
a little bit
that's
about
where the
that.
damage is being done.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit about that because I mean, listen, I didn't pitch, and so like would have had Division 1 baseball offers. I chose football, but like even now, like my arm is still like my right shoulder is still significantly less mobile, tighter than my left arm. I attribute to all the throwing I did growing up, and even like from a football perspective, throwing the football all with my right hand. And I can only imagine the young generation now with the AAU circuit that we're playing, how often these kids are throwing. Again, not my area of expertise, but when I apply common sense, I assume that they are not getting one, the appropriate physical training to meet the demands of the volume of pitches that they're throwing. And I'd love to hear your perspective on, hey, what is going on with the UCL epidemic and just arm problems in general for pitchers? And how do you address it at a young age?
Well, I think that the thing that has to be addressed is creating guardrails and standards that actually get adhered to. And I don't have the answer. There are people way smarter than me, with medical backgrounds and physical therapy backgrounds and biomechanic backgrounds that are all right. This is always talked about and being worked on. Studies here, studies there. There's, USA Baseball and MLB have come out with certain recommendations about, pitch count and usage, but there's no, that's not policed. There's not, these things, if a kid pitches on a Friday in a high school game in, at the end of their high school season in June, and then they pitch on Sunday in a travel ball game for the travel ball club that they're on because that coach wants his best pitcher pitching. There's not, whether it's a lack of communication, a lack of transparency, or just a lack of give a shit. There's no way to
Monitor.
forcibly monitor and put restrictor plates on that aspect, I think, and then you go down that philosophical rabbit hole about the monetization of youth sports and right
Mm.
capitalism, and everybody's got an up, should have the right to try to make a job, but at what expense? I think that, and you see some of the things about like, well, why does Finland have this great development process, or Denmark, some of these, pick a country, pick a small country where they have, a much more centralized youth athlete development system. Well, you're also talking about countries that have a population the size of, a state here.
Mm.
And it's almost like it's not too big to fail because there is failure happening. It's too big to control. And I don't have the answer. I'm not smart enough to have the answer in that. But it still comes back to the idea that, like, I think the old school, and at my age, I think, that's what I grew up in. Kids are indestructible. Hey, go out, whatever, play tackle football in the street, do whatever, just don't come home till the street lights come on, whatever. Now everything's so hyper organized and early sports specialization, and the more is gooder, and parents that are unreasonably hopeful that their kid is going to be the next Cy Young Award winner or Michael Jordan or Paul Skeens or Tom Brady or whatever it's going to be. And kids, it's like these micro traumas of overuse, especially in repetitive movement patterns, that are just killing kids when they're not physically mature enough to handle it, and there's not enough of a break, right? It really kind of comes back to the whole idea of like rotating crops and what they learned, hundreds of years ago about keeping the soil fertile by, you know, changing everything that was going on from a crop standpoint. I think it's the same thing with early sports specialization. It's the kids aren't getting exposed to enough different stimulus, physical stimulus, and when they are, sometimes it's forced, right? Forced. And it doesn't end up being complementary. It ends up being contradictory or concurrent, and it's not in their best interest.
At what age do you think specialization makes sense?
I think training age, player, versus biological age, or, experience age might probably factors into it. I think that we're seeing that, like, that 16 to 17-year-old age range is probably best, really. I think because you're kind of you're on the back end of adolescence, and you're on the early, again, depending on the individual, kind of on the early end of that, like, adult maturation process. Because you still have kids that are 16, 17 that are, all of a sudden they turn 19 and they're 4 inches taller than they were 2 years earlier, right? It's just kind of, that's where, mom and dad and your true family genetics come into play? Again, there's no answer because now it comes back to the individual. But I think that it's just 13, 14, and again, and maybe it probably depends on the sport. Is it how how much? And this is a question I can't answer, so it's really more of a hypothetical. If you start specializing in, let's just say, soccer, okay, um, because it kind of comes back to that idea of it being a more chaotic environment versus baseball, where it's this over and over and over and over again. I don't know. I think it's the specialization in the particular motor pattern, repetitive aspect that's doing the damage versus focusing in on a sport that's got a little bit more overall general athleticism to it,
I
if
get
that
so
makes sense.
fascinated in this space because I see this is just a conversation I really enjoy having because I see that there's different arguments to be made for different ends of the spectrum. And the one argument that, you know, I see a lot of strength and conditioning coaches make is in the realm of that the best athletes play multiple sports because they're just the best athletes and good at everything. And at a certain point, for some people who are less generally athletic, it makes sense to specialize at some point. And then I think about all of like generational athletes because I love the high performance side. I get really fascinated with the outliers. I think of like Novak Djokovic, Lionel Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, LeBron James, and you know, a lot of these guys, Steph Curry, like a lot of these guys did specialize for a long period of time. Now, hey, Steph Curry's an elite golfer. LeBron James was an elite football player. I get those things too. But like, I look at some of these, high intensity skill sports, baseball, golf, tennis, wrestling. And a lot of these people did specialize at a young age. So I get that side of the argument too. And I tend to operate in the mode that I think one, playing multiple sports is really good for general athletic development. You learn how to move your body in different ways. You get resilience, adaptations from different sports psychologically and physically. And then I also do believe that, of course, like if you're more athletic, you're going to play multiple sports because being better is more fun. And so you will do those things. And I just think it's so fascinating because I do see a lot of people who are so definitive on one side and so definitive on another. And I think it's much more gray and it depends on your natural ability in said sport, your physical maturity, and the types of sport that you're playing. Because I look over in Europe, one of my buddies, played college football with, he came over from Italy. He said, I asked him, what got you into football and not soccer? He said, well, I wasn't in a professional academy by the age of 12, so I had to find a new sport. And so, so it's like, I'm like, well, there's all these like different things. I just find it super fascinating because I'm not sure there is a right answer. I might be seeking nothing.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think I think it just comes back to it depends, right? I think it depends can answer a lot of questions that sound wishy-washy, but it's still
It's
valid.
nuanced.
It's very nuanced because first of all, you don't there's a social aspect to all of this too, right? And that's I think part of part of it is the idea of like just different experiences and different interactions, and it helps you mature from an emotional and psychological standpoint. You know, we don't like we all shy. We all like it's a natural defense mechanism, right? You shy away from things that are hard. Just because you're good in one sport doesn't mean you're going to be good in another. Well, if I'm not going to be good at it, then why should I play it, right? And that might be part of it. Um, it's a little chicken and egg, like to the point you kind of said. Is a guy playing multiple sports because he's just such a good overall athlete that he's going to be good at all of them, or you know, or do they gravitate to what they're good at and let the rest of it fall by the wayside? I think environment has a lot to do with it too. I think if you're like a small high school, then there's probably an expectation that you're going to play multiple sports because it's just probably kind of inherent that you need bodies to fill out rosters, and it just kind of becomes the cycle, right? Football to basketball to baseball, or football to wrestling to 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 track and field, whatever your mix might be. And you don't necessarily have to be good at all of them. And instead of just saying, "Oh, well, I'm good at this one thing, so everything I do is going to be centered around that, and I'm going to spend my off seasons training to get better at that." I can't really say it's wrong because it's not for me to judge. I think it just becomes, like you said, it's nuanced and it's sort of general philosophical, and I think it may just have a lot to do with sort of the community environment that you grew up in. If you're in a school with 4,000 kids versus 400, then you might be the 50th guy on the football roster, but you're a starting five guy in hoops. So why am I going to be the 50th guy on the football roster? But again, some kids see value to that because they just want to hang out with their buddies. I think in the end, that's probably kind of what's lost. I get a sense that that's kind of what's lost. If I'm not good enough to play, then what's the point? Well,
That is so true, and I hate that. Like, I actually just had a conversation with a younger athlete about that not too long ago, where they were fixated because they were embarrassed because they weren't playing, and they decided to quit. I was like, "What?" Like, and I get it too. It's easy for me to come down, from my level and say, what's the point when I had a very successful career in the sports I did play? Like I was a starter, I was, a successful player, but it was never necessarily just about that. One, I did things because I enjoyed it. I trained hard because I enjoyed it. I wanted to be really good. It was always, I wanted to, be the best, but I don't understand the mindset of if I'm not going to play like, or if I'm not going to be on the field or on the court, why do it? And because knowing what I know now of all the infinite things that come from playing sport that prepare you for life or that create a more robust personality, that create a more resilient self. And I get very frustrated with parents and, youth and high school sports because I believe it is constantly being preached of the wrong messages. And we've become a very self-centered society and we don't focus enough on serving one a greater purpose, but two understanding too we get downstream benefits from doing things we may not be the best at too.
right, and I think I'm gonna touch on a point that you made there based on a recent experience of mine. But I think the other thing too is people struggle to sort of wait their turn anymore.
Mm,
There's an expectation that and we've enabled it. We've made it easier, right? Look at like in college,
yep.
NIL, transfer portal. Like I can't play here, so I'm going to jump to there. Or I'm too good for here, so I'm going to jump to there. It's become very mercenary. And obviously there's an aspect of that in pro sports, but at the same time, when you sign a contract and made a commitment, you're expected to honor that commitment. And we've allowed that aspect to get away from us. And I think that in the very big sort of societal picture, I think that that's not good. I think it's not good. We made it too easy to just drop from commitments and, what does someone's word mean anymore? Or what are they legally bound to? I think that it's hard to unring the bell or put the toothpaste back in the tube, but boy, that needs a lot of reform. And I think there's some people with some good ideas out there. It's just being, getting enough momentum or, having strong enough people to enable that and enact that to put some guardrails back in place and tighten things up a little bit so it's not just a wild west and it's not just a shit show everywhere. But the I just spent 11 days in Japan, first trip ever to Japan because I was fortunate enough to get assigned over there by Major League Baseball. And it's a really interesting society. It's a really interesting place and a very population dense. It's not like they don't have a lot of people. There are a lot of people over there, but the idea of having a responsibility to the collective versus I'm an individual and you're trampling on my rights if I can't express myself. I think it's hard because I know you can make an argument for both sides, but I was really impressed by everything over there and just the organization and structure and behavior, societal behavior over there. And, you'll have some people on one extreme saying they're a bunch of sheep, or you'll say, well, you know what? You have to live side by side with your fellow man and for the greater good. This is behavior that is probably should be admired and sought to be emulated in some respects. But
Yeah, I think that's very so I've heard so I actually know of like 4 people who've just come back from Japan, ironically enough.
mm,
And one of the things that I think are really unique in terms of like human behavior and societal behavior that is really hard to figure out what's right and what's wrong is so one of my friends was born in Japan, comes from there, went, visited, came back, talks about how they hate tourism, they hate I shouldn't say they hate, but they don't like new cultures, new people coming into Japanese culture and trying to change things. And humans are very tribal in nature, and we want to be with others who are like us. Now, on the other side of that is, innovation, development comes from diversity of thought and getting new ideas, new cultures, new mixes in there. And I think part of the problem in, American sports and American culture is we don't have like one true culture of nationality. We are a mixture of a bunch and it creates conflict and tension to where it's hard because there's no like understanding which one culture are we serving. That's one thing why I appreciate so much about sports is because we can create sectors of that in the, American world is, hey, if you're part of this team, this is what we're about. You have to serve this purpose.
mm,
And so the human behavior side of it and the societal culture, the behavior behind it is when it's sports specifically, it can be so challenging when you have too many people of different, personalities. And I think it was Pete Carroll that said it, and I really liked it, is you can have different personalities, but you can't have different mentalities. And you have to have one mentality and you can comprise the personalities underneath as long as they have the same mentality. And I just think it's a really hard thing to execute, but it is very something philosophically that I agree with.
yeah, I mean, again, because it's right. It can, in some respects, it could be a microcosm of society, but within the parameters and the framework of sport and the game, whatever your chosen sport slash game is, right? The outcome is to compete and to ideally to win. At what point does that become the primary goal? Right, is up for debate. Like, how important is it for the U12 team,
Right.
in your travel ball to win, to play
Right.
9 games over 72-hour span in order to win, you know, a medal or a plastic trophy, right? Because you can make two sides of the argument. Oh, this should be for fun. It should be for development. It should be for, kids to, develop, good habits. Oh, you want to keep score, you want to win, not everybody can win. There's, it's life, life lessons. Not everybody's number one. What's
Right.
right? Because you can have two people, right? It's just like anything else, right? You got two people at both ends of the spectrum that can be polarizing, making a valid argument for either case. And the truth generally falls somewhere in the middle, and I don't know what the answer to that is, but what you said, like if, Coach Carroll said, it's a little different when you're getting paid for it, or you're finally at the like the upper echelon because, right, you play to win the game, you play to compete, you play to win. And that in the end should be if everybody's going to be wearing the same logo and hunting for the same outcome, then whatever your role within that mechanism is, then you should be trying to be the best within that role. And if you're a nose guard, then you have to realize that, you may get credited with 2 tackles a game, but if your linebackers are making 15, you're probably doing your job and you have helped do your part to win the game. If you have a nose guard that is caught up with the idea, well, I'm going to get paid if I show some sack numbers, and all of a sudden they're you know, trying to play outside of the system in order to pump up their own personal stats, but everything is crumbling around them because they're not occupying that A gap or taking up the 2 offensive linemen like they should, then you're not helping the team and you're not helping the collective, what is supposed to be the collective outcome.
Part of the reason I hate the media because they will stat and I'm gonna use football because that's the game I'm most familiar with. They
Sure.
will stat search. and they'll be like, "Oh, this guy's a game wrecker." When we use your nose guard example, they had X amount of sacks, TFLs, but what they're not counting for is all of the MAs and missed assignments that enabled big gap plays that it
Right.
created explosives. Some organizations are really stupid, just flat out. Some professional organizations are just really bad. Okay. And they succumb to those types of things. But the good organizations and the people who are really good at evaluating players notice the guys who do their job exceptionally well that may not show up on the stat sheet, and they will reward those players. And we unfortunately showcase to the younger athletes who are coming up that individual self is always more important, and to go get those stats, to go get those numbers, because then you're going to get paid with a big fat check. But we don't talk about the other side. Well, if you do your job and do your job exceptionally well from a disciplined manner, hey, maybe you don't get all the stats that you're looking for, but there's still equal, if not more money to be made, and be in a winning organization and in a winning environment, which also is going to increase, your mood, increase your productivity, increase your longevity, which may lead to more money to be made if that's the ultimate goal. And not that side is not talked about enough because it's not sexy, it's not entertaining, it's not highlights. It's I did my job, I did it consistently, I did it exceptionally well, and I'm going to be rewarded for that in some capacity. And again, I hate saying as society, I hate generalizing, but a lot of that is missed right now. And it is making leadership positions incredibly difficult to hold right now because you have to find new ways to communicate and bring these points home.
Yeah, well, it's right. It's objective versus subjective, essentially in the end, and that's tough in pro sports, right? Right. The joke, especially in baseball, when you get to arbitration, is you may think that you had a great first 3 years in pro baseball, and maybe you made an all-star team, and you've accumulated these stats. You get to arbitration, and then you find out exactly how bad you were, right? Because you
Yeah.
want $1.5 million and they're offering you a million, and now both sides are trying to make their argument, and if you can't meet somewhere in the middle or get that contract hammered out, you're going to present your case to the arbitrator. And I've heard plenty of guys say it. Man, I never knew how shitty I was at this game until I went to arbitration. Um,
Yes.
and that's probably happens in anywhere. So economics makes things really tough, right? Everybody wants more, and everybody wants to maximize their value. And even just coming back to the strength conditioning side of it, I've always said, I've told young strength coaches, I said our job is to try to help. We're trying to help athletes, and I've said this. What I've said to athletes is, hey, you're literally you're your own individual corporation. I said, so how can I help you? Part of my dialogue has to be, how can I help you? Because sometimes it's not even just about like performance. It's not the superstar aspect of performance. It's trying to create longevity. Like, if you're a middle to the back end of the roster athlete in whether it's whatever sport, right? But you can create some longevity. Now all of a sudden you've strung together 10 years and you've maxed out your pension in baseball. Maybe you were only making the league minimum or the veteran minimum for those 10 years, which compared to the average person is quite a bit of money, but not necessarily enough to live on for the rest of your life. But now you had this pension, and the MLB pension is tremendous, so that you have something that is going to fortify the back end of your life at least. Now you have to close that gap between the end of your career and when you can reasonably start collecting your pension. But the same thing in football, right? What do people say? What's the best job in the NFL?
I would say punter or
Well,
backup quarterback. Sorry.
bingo, right?
Yeah.
Be the
I
second or third
forgot.
quarterback, right? Be the
Yeah.
second or third quarterback,
I would pick punter personally. I think that's the best job. But sorry,
right?
you're right. People do say backup quarterback.
Right? Or long snapper, right? Kind of
Nah,
out of this.
long snapping sucks. Don't let anyone tell you differently. Long snapping
Well,
sucks.
but there have been plenty of guys that all of a sudden you blink and you see that Joe Long Snapper just finished his 13th year in the
13th
league,
year in the yep.
right?
Yep.
But you joke, right? Backup third quarterback, clipboard,
Emergency
you're in on the
quarterback. Sign
plate,
me up.
and you probably set yourself up for a nice coaching career when you're done, because you're almost like You're almost like a player coach, probably.
Yep.
But so that's, there's that really should be part of your consideration as a coach of what you're trying to help these athletes do for their lives
Yeah.
versus just their athletic performance. And I think it takes some time to recognize that if you haven't been, that hasn't been sort of verbalized to you early on in your career. Like you realize that through, I can be life changing for someone if I help them hang on.
Yeah.
And if you're the 25th guy, well, now 26th guy on a Major League Baseball roster, you're still better than the 180 guys behind you in the organization. And you can make a living and a career out of that. You can quietly go about your business. And those are the guys that are usually right. They realize, they kind of know what their limitations are, but they go and they put the work in and they're prepared. They're certainly the best ones. The best ones embrace that, and and they know that, hey, I'm gonna be the guy that they can count on and be reliable, and I'm always going to be ready mentally and physically. And even those opportunities have changed in baseball now with the universal DH. And
Hmm.
like, you're not going to have a Mark Sweeney or Lenny Harris ever again, because how frequently does someone get pinch hit for? It's very rare these days. Maybe for a lefty righty, maybe to switch up the matchup later in the game, but it's just, the game has become a little bit more homogenized. And I frankly find that sad. Those are conversations, you have philosophically with other guys in baseball. But for a guy who was a football player and a football coach and that came to baseball late, I really love the game, and there are aspects of it that I miss. And I get the business part of it, and the things they do. It's just right. We all, as you get older, you all wax poetic about time's gone by, and what's lost in the past. And I'm not the first, I won't be the last. And there were guys my age 30 years ago saying the same thing about where things were at then. But it's just a shame when sort of some of the wrinkles in different things that really made it unique and interesting those wrinkles start to get a little bit ironed out, and it just becomes a little vanilla.
When you were in Pittsburgh and you mentioned some of these guys earlier,
Yeah,
Andrew
You've had Mike McHenry on your podcast way too much.
Mc-
I think I was scrolling through your history. I think I saw like 4 of them in there. So
it's probably gonna be more too. Fort's my guy. He's I love getting him on here. He's one of my favorite guests, and
yeah,
we were
he's
texting
awesome.
earlier this morning about getting him on again. But so some of my favorite players ever in baseball: Andrew McCutchen, Starling Marte. What made those guys exceptional? What made them different?
Well, I didn't work with Kutch. He got traded that same off season that I came in, traded or signed somewhere else. So I'll never forget, because when I took the job with Pittsburgh in early January of 2018, um, I got his number. My thing is, first of all, I'm not afraid to reach out to anybody. So I got the numbers, started reaching out to some of the veteran guys, and I texted Kutch, and literally, I think it was like a day later, he got traded. So he never answered me. He never answered me.
Yeah,
I still got his number. If he hasn't changed his number, I still got his number, but he never answered me. And it's funny too, because right, there are a lot of guys in the league that I didn't work with, but I've been around a long time. So especially through the 2000s and through the 2010s, when you're just around, unless you're shy, you have opportunities to interact. You still have opportunities to interact with. And when you're seeing the same people over and over and over again, they kind of know who you are. You can still build some relationships. But Kutch, what I was getting at is, oddly enough, I never really had much interaction with Kutch. So I'm thrilled. I think it's great. I love the fact that he made his roster. I'm really happy for him, because I do respect the shit out of him. I think he's a hell of a player. I sadly didn't get to develop a relationship with him. Starling, love him, works hard. Like, he just, right. I think he's making the Royals roster. I mean, he's just ageless. He's had a couple injuries, right? I know he had a knee thing right a few years ago, but man, he's one of those really outlier athletes where he's just been able to retain a lot of his athleticism, and he's still right. And again, he's clearly playing because he loves the game, because
hmm
he doesn't need to. He's made plenty of money, and money goes a long way on the island. those guys that have made money and elect to stay in the DR, they live like kings, but they, and they hire their whole little security forces and everything to kind of, right? Because of the economic, you think we've got economic disparity here, you talk there, it can be really
Pretty
wide.
bad.
But,
Yeah.
he's still playing because he loves the game. And he was a guy, he was so much fun to be around because it never seemed like he had a bad day. He was just always up. He's just always up, like personality wise. He was always up. So much fun to be around and so much fun to watch play. And like I said, I mean, him and Polanco together, they were two of the funnier guys to roll in. And like I said, 90, not even almost, definitely 90% of the time when they worked out, it was together and it was always after a game. Um, there'd be some funny times when we were literally the only three people in the weight room at 10:30 at night, and it would be some funny stuff. And by the way, Starling is freakish, especially when he's younger,
Yeah.
freakishly strong. Loved to
I
squat and
would
lunge,
imagine
which I
because
love.
he had a laser. He was super fast. He could hit the ball everywhere in the park. I really enjoyed watching him play.
Yeah, and he wasn't a big guy. I mean, he was very muscular, but he wasn't a big guy. And
Yeah.
he's doing lunges with 275 and squatting 365 for reps, and could have been doing more. But we
Yeah.
didn't need. But again, it kind of comes back to what we talked to earlier. He didn't need to. That's kind of like he knew. Like just because I knew he could do more, it wasn't like I was chasing him around to put. Well, let's put 405. He didn't need to. He's strong and he moved well and he was explosive and then Polanco, very different body type, much longer legs, high backside, tall, different levers. So he wasn't a back squat guy, but I'd have him goblet squat to fortify the pattern. But he was a big lunge guy, lunge and step up guy. Big
Mm.
legs, high. Like I said, high backside. But man, they were just fun and just special athletes. Special athletes.
Well, this is why I end up with getting people, Ford on my podcast 4 different times. I had this whole script. I got through maybe a fifth of it. So we'll have to get we'll have to get you back again. I'm actually at the point with Ford. I don't even have a script anymore. We just get on and talk.
Well, yeah, yeah.
But no, hey, I appreciate you for coming on. This was a fun conversation for me. I know we've been trying to get it for a little bit now, so I'm glad we got it on.
I know. What I wanted to ask you is because we actually didn't discuss this kind of leading up. How did I end up on here?
Yeah.
How did
So
that happen? Because
with a lot of
I'm
my
always
base,
shocked when people ask me because I'm not big. I don't have like a shtick. I don't have like a system that I sell. I don't. I personally, I told you, I think I'm terrible at social media. I know you're entertained because I'm not afraid to kind of pop off on some things, but I'm not great at all that stuff because I'm not good at selling myself. And I don't feel I have anything to sell other than just being authentic. I try to be authentic. So I was
so I would
curious. I wanted to
say
ask how I
this.
ended up on here.
So recently I've been having a lot more baseball guys. I would say baseball guys in general, probably some of the more generous, kind demographic I interact with. Additionally, they're pretty in tune with a lot of the things that I do and the things that I like to talk about. But so with I forget which baseball guy I had on, you had either commented or liked like one of the posts and you ended up following me on social media and I followed you back, looked through your stuff. And I have a strong interest in the strength and conditioning field as well. And so I was like, hey, why not? Would love to get him on, get his expertise on some of this stuff. That's how it came to fruition, my friend.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Appreciate you
I
answering,
enjoyed it. Yeah. Yeah. No,
but
I always appreciate being asked because I'm not like jumping. I'm not jumping around and trying to get on a bunch of these. I never know how I come off.
nah, hey, I appreciate it. And if you do have anything to promote or people can reach out to you or if people want to work with you, how can they reach out to you? How can they find your stuff?
Yeah, so my socials are right at J Malone Strength. My website is Baseball Strength Academy. I'm trying to get into the space where I'll try to do some online stuff with kids if they're interested. I don't have that fully formulated. I'm a terrible procrastinator and I also have terrible imposter syndrome, but I'd like to get some programs out there for kids that they can jump on if they want to, or if anybody's interested in some one-on-one stuff. I'm just at a point now with not being with an organization or a team. I do a lot of work with MLB and doing a lot of work with USA weightlifting. So my last little plug will also be for any peripheral, sports outside of baseball, especially college and high school strength coaches, if they happen to listen to this. I'm the athlete identification and recruitment coordinator for USA weightlifting. We're trying to kind of, I won't say parallel or mimic what USA bobsled does, but we're trying to create an awareness that if you are a powerful, strong and powerful athlete and your career is over in your sport of choice, you may have an alternative. And, if you want to try weightlifting, then I'm the guy to reach out to.
Well,
It can
maybe
be
I'll try
obviously
that. I've been
very,
looking for a new challenge.
yeah, be very sort of, it's obviously very specific. You have to have the physical, the physical tools to be able to snatch and clean and jerk, and a snatch in
Count
particular.
me
So
out.
yeah, snatch is a snatch is a really, really difficult movement. We're looking for outlier athletes that might be able to do that. And we got a page dedicated to that on the USA weightlifting website. But again, that's kind of a whole different tangent. But I do want to make people aware of that, because it's if you're a really strong, powerful athlete, you might be a gymnast, you might be cheer and tumbling, you might be baseball, wrestling, football, track and field. But once your competitive career is over and you've got the capacity to maybe give weightlifting a try, um, I'm the guy to talk to.
Awesome. I appreciate it, man.
So
Listeners, thank you for tuning in. Tune in next week. Download the pod, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check us out at athletic42.com. 5 stars only, baby. Appreciate you, Jim.
thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it.